Good morning. We'll talk today about competitive analytics. We will talk a little bit about metrics and concepts, and this is Dr. Pratham Datta. The essence of analytics lies in thinking strategically but acting on evidence. Evidence alone doesn't allow you to make the next move unless you actually have a plan. On the other hand, if you just want have a plan, but you don't have anything to support your convictions or your moves, or whether it's tactical in the short run or strategic in the long run, you might find it very difficult to get things moving. So we're going to start off today with concepts in competitive analytics. So we'll cover all the basic terms and everything that you need to know, but we'll also get into this whole mode of trying to think logically, but also logically with some kind of support using data. Right, so that's the whole idea. We're going to focus on why is it that people use certain things, and how do you get there. But to begin, the first thing I need to mention is I absolutely enjoyed reading your pieces on metrics, but there are certain very interesting issues, and you've tried to address them, and we'll carry on with that discussion as we even move forward. Because do realize what you're looking for when you're saying that a metric that we typically use, you're looking at something called an outcome variable. So, or also known as a dependent variable. So, it's called an outcome or dependent variable. So this whole idea of a dependent variable is we're trying to reach that goal. So what I try to do with that metrics exercise is for you to think of what is the type of outcome that you want? What is the preferred outcome that you want? Now, whether somebody talks about customer experience or freshness of donut or sales volume, the thing is, that's your final objective. And it's very important for us to understand what the final objective is before we try to trace what are the things that affect it. Now, when we meet in class, possibly 2 weeks later, we're going to dig right into creating these kinds of models where we'll be able to understand what are the factors that lead to it. And how do you not only collect data, but once you have data, how could you predict? Firstly, how would you know which one of the factors are the most important? And the second part is, how would you be able to therefore predict, based on what factors are most important, what you ought to focus on in order to reach your final destination? So, as we move forward with it, it's important to know that this choice itself is sort of predicated by multiple different things. And the first piece of the puzzle is something slightly different, which is, let me see if I can open a new page and note a few things. So, suppose you want to, can you guys read the page on the whiteboard? Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. So suppose you want to check customer experience as they enter a bank. So could somebody be kind enough to start off in terms of, could you tell me the sequence of things that customers do once they enter a bank? And as you keep mentioning them, I'm going to sort of start adding to that set itself. So anybody stand in the queue, all right? Stand Let's
Typically,
see.
they'll like um, walk in and want to either fill out a deposit slip or with like a withdrawal slip.
Very nice. Let's do it in steps. One is they'll stand in queue. Second is make deposit, or let's put it as make a transaction, right? So it could be any kind of transaction. What do they do after that? All right, so you could say they close the transaction, and then of course they leave or exit, right? All right, fair enough. But there's Kai mask on. Yes, true. You have to do that. That's an imperative. But but anyway, so let's assume you want to look at you want to increase the overall experience that a customer has when he or she enters a bank, right? Or comes to the bank and leaves. So let's uh, why don't you throw me some numbers in terms of, so assume the banks set up a mechanism where they've said that it should be less than 5 minutes that they should stand in line, and you want to look at people's experiences. Now, what would be a percentage of people that you think is a good tolerable percentage where people, you know, for people to be standing for less than 5 minutes? What's a good percentage? So you're looking at how many people ended up standing in line for more than 5 minutes versus less than 5 minutes. What's a good percentage? 95%, 90%? Anybody wants to
I would,
throw me a number?
I would say 95%. I believe it.
So Eric said 85, you say 95. Shall we come to compromise and say 90? Just to give you an example. Fair enough. Now, what about suppose this is now we're talking about satisfaction with making a transaction. What would be your what would be a decent percentage that you could? Yes, true. I don't know. Let's talk about those geriatrics who go to a bank. Let's not bring. So assume we're talking about geriatric customers in a bank, Janet. Right. All right. So why don't you give me a percentage in terms of satisfaction? Satisfaction. So give me a percentage that's acceptable for you to say that customers satisfied with making a transaction. Yeah, so you're right. Making a transaction, basically, if you were to write it, you'll say that is a function of multiple things, right? Time spent, issues resolved, uh, among many other bits, right? So, but let's give. Why don't you give me a percentage in terms of that was 90%? What would be an acceptable percentage for you to talk about? Satisfaction with making a transaction. Anyone?
For a transaction like a deposit or withdrawal,
Yes, a
I would
deposit, a
expect it should
withdrawal,
be
a
greater than
balance check.
95%.
95, all right, fair enough. 95%. Thank you. What about closing the transaction, which is making sure that they have all the information they need, they, whatever bank card that they were given and everything's done. What percentage? What's a decent with how the transaction was closed and ended?
I would even say it's 100% because
All right, fair enough.
95,
Uh,
that 5% could have a detrimental effect on some of the transactions
true,
or the
true,
customer
true.
events. So
All right, fair enough. So closing the transaction, 100%, and leaving how, whether it's entering the bank. So let's say enter and leave. So how easy is it to sort of access the bank in general? So accessing the bank, um, what would be a decent percentage for you to say that all right, people are satisfied with, um, you know, the way how easy it is to access the bank, enter the bank, leave the bank, and so forth. True, yes, Jamie writes. There are way more transactions, so let's assume we're lumping all the transactions together because then we'll start adding a little bit to it to figure out where these differences even lie. So it's more than deposits and withdrawals. You're dealing with so many different things. So, but assume it's still your satisfaction with making a transaction. And enter and leave, assume you say that as long as 90% of people are happy with the ease of accessing the bank and the ease of exiting the bank and so forth, right? It's you're not parking isn't a big problem. There isn't an issue in terms of whether it's a door issue or something like that. None of those things would matter. So let's put it at 90%. So here's my question to you. What is the overall customer satisfaction with the bank? So could anybody try and guess what would be all right, so I think Adam mentioned 99%, so let's change it to 99%. So what is the overall? Oh, all right, that very, very nice. So let's Jamie, brilliant point. So weights are very important, which one is more important, which one is less important. But let's revisit it in possibly 5 minutes, because that's going to be the next part of this story. So let's first say that assume right now you've got, so these are, as you would call them, activities, and now you have weights. Now if we don't assign separate weights, we basically say there are 4 activities. 100 divided by 4 would be 25%, so these are 25% each, right? Sorry, let's see. 25% each. Fair enough. And so what is right now, what's the total experience of customers in the bank? Anyone? Jamie, Matthew, Eric, Adam, anyone? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think we're all just trying to do the math.
Ah, right, okay. Cool.
93.75%.
93. Now, how did you get that number?
Sorry, I was actually just looking at I was looking at wrong numbers here. I apologize.
No, that's all right. But if you just tell me how you're even getting at it, that'd be lovely.
Total all the percentages and then divide by 4.
See, all right. So one way you could say is it's average, right? It's the average of all of them. So and then you just basically do the averages, and you get. And what are you getting when you're talking about the averages? What are the averages? Or what's the average in this case?
The average is 96% and more people.
So average is 96. The question is, so average is equal to 96 because all you're doing is, which is 90 plus 95 plus 100 plus 99 divided by 4. The question that I'm going to ask you is, do you think that's the right value for your customer experience? So are you saying that your average customer satisfaction with or customer experience satisfaction is a 96%? Yes, and of course, in this case, if you were to think of it as a weighted set, all you are doing in the process is you're saying it's 0.25 times 90 plus 0.25 times 95 and so forth, and you're saying that right now it's basically, that's why if it's 0.25, all it means is divided by 4. Fair enough, but how many of you agree that 96% is the right number? Manuel, you say it's not the right number, so why not, Manuel?
Yeah, because I believe we need to. I don't know the number if you include the weights, but I believe we need to do this, including the weights.
All right, no, but think of it. The minute you're averaging it, you're already including the weights. That's why it's averaged by 4, right? So if you were to calculate it as, let's see, let's go back to this and say, let me see if I can get this.
With all these having the same weight, the average is going to come out to the same number. But I personally wouldn't rate them the same, because if I had to stand in line for 15 minutes, it's going to totally ruin my experience with going to the bank.
Fair enough. So yes. So let's get to the weights in a second. Let me see. Get my calculator. So let's do this. So the answer is a very interesting one. So let me create a new set and tell you something interesting. The answer is not the average. You know why? The response is overall customer experience, because each issue is leading to the next, is basically 0.9 times, and then we'll get to the weights, times 0.95 times 1 times 0.99, which is equal to, anyone? So, Manuel, for example, if you don't find a place to park, that's your entry and exit issue, and that's a big issue, right? So what number do you get now? Very nice. You get 84.6%. It's oftentimes, it's an anomaly that, or oftentimes we run foul by basically saying, well, it's the average. No. It's because it's a sequence. See, that's why I asked you, what's the sequence? Which basically means now if you were to check this and say that, all right, I want to know how well we performed on this metrics of overall customer experience. Each set, very much like what you study when you're compounding, it's a compounding effect that goes on. So, in this case, if each of them have equal weights, the answer is going to be exactly the same again, right? 84.6%. Let me ask you, what would be weights you would assign to them? So how would you change the weights in this case? Give me some new weights. Standing in the queue, what percentage would you, all right, what percentage would you assign to it? So I see Karen mentioned that making a transaction is the most important, so you want to assign it a 50% weight. What about standing in queue? 35%. Now, do realize they all have to add up to about, to actually not about, to 100%. So, which basically means you've got 15% left. How are you going to distribute the 15% across the sets? Ten five, all right, 10%, and 5%. All right, fair enough. So now let's revisit this and do the same and run the same set. So now your overall customer experience is equal to, anybody help me with the calculation, is going to be what? Any shout outs, any brave outs, come on. 0.35 times 0.9 plus 0.5 times 0.95 plus 0.1 times 1. Right, guys, everybody?
94%.
And you've calculated it's 94%, right? And 0.05 times 99. So this comes up to 94%, does it? Everybody able to get the same number? Perfect, right? So now the minute you're assigning different weights, you see that this basic set of 84.6%. So if you were to say they're all equal important, first realize it's not the average. It's always anything that's in a sequence. So the reason why I'm mentioning it is, next time you start looking at your, as I mentioned previously, you could have the best analytics, you would have the best minds, but if you don't have a good sense of the process, you're likely to end up choosing the wrong set in terms of what to assign and when to assign. So the first bit is, anytime you're trying to make anything better in your company, firstly look at the steps that people have to follow from entry to exit. Once you've got your entry to exit mapped out, specify all the steps, which is nothing but your general workflow, whether you're looking at your customer workflows or you're looking at your internal employee workflow, whether you're managing workflow for your team or you're managing workflow for your customers. So you're looking at workflow. Once you've got your workflows in order, then the thing is, understand the sequence. Now for each sequence, try and ask what is historically assigned as a nice tolerable level of performance. Percentages. Once you've got your entire sequence in order, then calculate your set without changing weights. Then change weights and see how that changes. And assume, so see, most of the time, these new weights that you provide, right? These are very interesting weights, but the question is, who should assign these weights? Management or customers? And the response typically would be what? Who should be assigning these weights? 35%, 50%? Very good. So the idea is, well, you could say management can assign weights, but here's the tricky bit, right? As we talked about, that metrics itself, analytics are tricky because it changes the definition. Because the question is, who changes the definition? If you hand it to management in terms of what would be a good weight, management could oftentimes assign a certain weight that makes this number look better. Because all they want to do is change the weights, play around with the weights where the numbers look better. But the question is, if you're really getting to if you really want to increase customer experience, the customers ought to be asked in terms of wherein would you place more emphasis versus wherein would you place less emphasis, right? And that oftentimes becomes the case, right? So that oftentimes becomes the case. So it's very, very important to realize that most processes, if not all, in any organization, is a sequence of processes. Every sequence has a certain task, a certain activity. Every activity ought to be understood and thought of in terms of what would define a good performance rate for that activity. Once you've known what's a good performance rate for that activity, your next stop is knowing, all right, your experience requires you to understand activities working together and in sequence, not separately. The minute you think it's separate, then what you'll do is you might, there are many different groups. Some group will say that, well, I'm just going to choose the minimum because the minimum is going to be the weakest link. True. But given the fact that you're getting 90% satisfaction standing in a queue, you already are dissatisfied. Your dissatisfaction now with the 95% of the transaction gets compounded. And after that entry leaving, even with that, the 99%, which is the 1% that's missing, is going to compound on that. So you have to. Sorry, can't you hear it? Can you hear me now? Can you guys still hear me? Brilliant, cool, sweet. Thank you very much. So got to put that sequence in order. Thank you very much. Thank you. You've got to put that sequence in order, and for each activity in a sequence, understand the overall impact. So next time you're checking for overall impact, anything that is based on a sequence or one depends on the other. For example, I remember as I was absolutely marveling reading your responses on metrics, I remember one of you mentioned something in terms of demand forecasting. And then, of course, the thing is, if you're looking at demand forecasting based on SKUs and pallet sizes and lot sizes and so forth, one thing affects the other. So yes, true. And because one thing affects the other, everything works as a process. So at the end of the day, your total experience is also a mechanism to, as Jamie rightly mentions, both identify and improve on processes, because that becomes your central cog. If that is missed out, then you can have the best metric, but you wouldn't really know exactly where to fix it. Given the fact that the starting end, if you again look at it, standing in queue, making a transaction, closing the transaction, there are companies that love to create this sense of what's your primary association, what's your catch. And if you know what your catches are, then these are the points where we need to improve the most, because that's what customers truly want from us. That's what our suppliers want from us. That's what our internal employees want from us, and so forth. Did I actually make sense? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So let's get on to useful analytical concept. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention was there was one metric that somebody n- remarked in something if it's a very subjective metric. For example, if you're talking about, for example, something very amorphous like whether something is fresh. And if I were to ask you, how on earth do you measure freshness? So if I were to ask you, how do you measure freshness? What's a metric, or what are would be, of course anything that's amorphous requires more dimensions, right? And so the idea is anything that is amorphous in nature requires more dimensions because you're trying to use multiple dimensions to get at it. So if I were to ask you freshness, so let's call freshness as f is a function of, so or depends upon what, freshness depends upon what. So if you ever walk into a boulangerie and say that, all right, I like, I don't know, a certain baguette or a certain souffle or whatever it is, a tart, and they give you something, all right, so all right, visual appearance, even though it's a bit deceiving sometimes, texture, flavor, anything else, time, aroma, right? So date and time, right? Time. So in this case, you'd say time that's passed already. A time sitting. So, taste, right? Very nice. So assume we stop it there. And then the question becomes, if each is the case, do you have a mechanism to check? So so here's the interesting thing. So how do you think, as Jamie mentioned, there's something called determined shelf life. How does a company define a predetermined shelf life? You see that marked on just about every single container, whether you're purchasing milk, says use by. What is this whole idea of use by? And so you would say that these use by depends upon historical data in terms of what goes wrong, where it happens, with, of course, certain assumptions. Where is it kept? Was it constantly in the freezer? Or was it constantly in a fridge? Was the supply chain carrying it through something called a cold supply chain, which is maintaining the same temperature across the entire set? So they can look at historical data using a series of assumptions, but then you have to ask yourself, is there a mechanism to assign how you could check for, or how could you objectify visual appearance? How would you objectify texture? How do you objectify flavor? How do you, well, this is an objective bit anyway, time sitting. Now, time sitting, what I'm trying to get at is, next time you look at a set of metrics or a set of dimensions that even define a metric, get into the core of, all right, time sitting. Is it time sitting from the minute it was prepared, or time sitting from the time it was delivered, or the time sitting from the time it was shelved? Each one has a different time sitting agenda, and the window can itself change exactly what. So it depends on exposures, right? So multiple different things, right? If it's suddenly, it's sitting in the sun, sitting in the shade, right? And you see these stories about, the very famous wines like Chateaubriand or Chateau Margaux or Chateau Lafite, that, of course, you might get a fantastic bottle of 1956 Chateau Lafite or a 68 Chateaubriand, and it's brilliant, but it's only brilliant to hold and to remark upon. It's likely that it's an absolutely shoddy bit to drink, mainly because you really don't know what the exposures have been, where it has been, whether it's been corked, and that's why they're always so worried. Things like exposure to light, temperature, oxygen, safer, right? That's why it's so difficult to ever create a set and know that, all right, this bottle is absolutely perfect. So whenever you're talking about things that are very amorphous in nature, you have to figure out that, can I, and again, same thing, right, as Mahmoud mentions, transportation, but the transportation, as I was mentioning, the use of transportation mechanism, especially for things like drugs and things like milk and all that stuff, called a cold supply chain, where they try to maintain exactly the same temperature and pressure and exposure points across the entire supply chain. The whole idea is, as if exposure changes, the entire metric itself is going to fall flat on its back. So it's important for you to understand the dimensions and find a mechanism to objectify dimensions. And that's why it's important for you to figure out, how do you measure each of them. And once you have a series of experts, whether you're using, we'll talk about techniques and so forth a little later, but even if you're using a set of experts, which is called a Delphi technique, using a set of experts to come up with weights or dimensions, is called Delphi technique. And of course, if some of you visited Greece, you see the very famous the Delphi temple, and it also is a place where it's the same technique, where you ask the question and you start with a large brainstorm, and then you make it slightly smaller, and then you ask them to prioritize and make it even smaller till you come to a sort of a consensus amongst a bunch of experts, and the experts typically ought to be people from multiple fields, which is, for example, if you're looking at a bank, it should look at overall customer satisfaction. If it's overall transactional satisfaction, you want to bring in the customers, you want to bring in the branch managers, you want to bring in the tellers, because a customer might, want to get something done, but frankly speaking, if the teller has to click through 10 different processes to give the customer a response, it just takes a lot of time. So you've got to bring in the right pieces of the puzzle that can actually come up with the right attributions and the right dimensions for you to even measure them. Does that sound fair? So again, two important bits we covered. Firstly, understanding the fact that you need to, whenever you're trying to measure things, to finish off this whole measurement, if any of your metrics is dependent on a sequence of activities, consider performance at every single piece of the activity, and realize that at the end of the day, it's a compounded effect that defines the total experience. The second piece of the puzzle is, if it's a metric that is somewhat nebulous or amorphous in nature, which is, it's very subjective, try to break it down into pieces that get closer and closer to a mechanism to actually measure it, and a mechanism to measure it properly. Question is, who defines how to measure it and how to measure it properly? You can use these experts and things like Delphi techniques to come up with that set, including things like, what are the more important pieces of the puzzle versus what are less important pieces of the puzzle. Now, just to finish off, you realize right now, when this section, this piece we mention about, I wonder why. Okay. This bit we mention in terms of weights and understanding whether it's amorphous or not, understanding historical performances and so forth, right now we are assigning weights or asking customers to assign weights. When we start doing prediction models, and I want to do prediction models when we're in class because it's something that requires much more involved interaction in the process, we'll, we'll find out ways where the system itself or the analytical algorithm itself will tell you which one's the most important and which one is not very important, which basically will tell you if you now were to be given a particular budget to improve something, where should you emphasize more and what should you emphasize less on in the process. So, but that's not till the next couple of weeks or so. So we'll carry on then. So let's go on to the next set. Any questions, guys, before I move on? Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Adam. Or a quick show of hands would be perfectly fine too. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Jamie. Thanks, Karen. Lovely. So let's move forward with it. So we're going to get into useful analytical concepts. Right. So talking about useful analytical concepts, the first one, which we started off even with that interesting anecdotal algorithm that Target ran, was based on this thing called a market basket analysis. So just to quickly read and then we'll explain the whole thing, is based on something called correlation and association, which is what do people what do people tend on purchasing, or what do people have proclivities towards purchasing together. So what you're trying to do is you're running analytics on shopping baskets or shopping carts to reveal what and how customer purchases together can make a future coupon or a purchase prediction. So the whole idea is, if you find that people tend to purchase one thing with another, then it suddenly changes the way you know exactly what to offer the customer as sort of either discounts or not discounts, or not giving them discounts. What should you direct them towards? Now this is the basis for something called customer relationship management. So you use analytics to attract new customers and retain current customers. And you might have heard this ad nauseum. The whole idea behind this is
Recording started.
So the whole idea behind this is when you're running this, it's retaining customers is always, as they say, it's always cheaper than attracting new customers. It costs about 6 times more to retain a customer than it is to get to get a new customer than it is to retain a customer. So I'm going to show you an interesting puzzle piece. Not really a puzzle piece, but an interesting anecdotal bit that came out of 10 years of running point of sale data on Walmart. So what they found, this is known as the very famous, it's called the beer and diaper paradox. Anybody ever heard of it? No. So all right. Thanks, Karen. So thank you, Karen. Thank you, Julie. So all it says is that from analyzing point of sale data, they found that people who tend to true, Now, do you realize, Jamie, they don't mention whether these are adult diapers or normal diapers. But that's a different story altogether. It also doesn't really mention, the specific gender, but those are things left for our own sort of mental concoction and our own imagination. So what they found was people who tend to purchase beer also tend to purchase diapers, because all they did was they ran these market basket analyses to find what do people tend to purchase together, and these are called association rules. And you'll see these association rules play themselves beautifully when you go to a place like Amazon.com, where they say that you know that they have this thing called a recommender system, where they say that if you know, people who tend to purchase this also tend to purchase something else, right? So they are called recommender systems, and this is called the very famous beer diaper paradox. So with this beer diaper paradox, they find it true. There you go. Parents need to boost deal. True, you know, and there's the thing. My question to you is as follows. You assume somebody ran a series of big correlations or clustering. So we'll talk about so correlation basically tests whether one thing, you know, whether one or two things or multiple things move when the other one moves. So correlation basically is based on the fact that anything that's correlated appears to move together, not always in the same direction. Correlation could be negative, correlation could be positive. So if I were to ask you, so more on a financial, so more on the financial side of the puzzle, if I were to ask you, what's the correlation between a company trying to acquire another company, a publicly traded company trying to acquire another company, and its stock price? What would you say? Is it a negative one? Is it a positive correlation? What's the correlation? Anyone? So a publicly traded company is trying to purchase or acquire another company. So suppose tomorrow Facebook says, I'm going to go and acquire this company. What if you are an investor and you say, loads of you say positive, so if you're an investor, would that, assuming you're setting up a derivative trade, are you going to go for a call? So are you going to go for a buy, or are you going to put a put as a sell? What would you do? Put on the buy. So Jamie says put on the buy. So, and put on the buyer, call on the seller. And the answer is typically, so which basically means the correlation between the company who's acquiring and, so if you're doing an acquisition and the company that's being sold, it's true, you're right, it depends on who's acquiring and the company that's selling it. So is the correlation negative or positive? So you would say, all right, so you're saying neutral typically. So one mechanism, because there's no single set but if you look at historical data, the stock price of the acquiring company, the company that's acquiring, is likely to drop the minute they mention an acquisition, versus the stock price of the company that's being acquired, assuming that's a publicly traded company too, is going to go up when somebody mentions that it's going to be acquired, or the announcement comes through the pipeline that it's going to be acquired, which basically says that the acquirer to the acquired correlation would therefore be a negative correlation. One goes up. When one goes up, the other one goes down. You see the same thing. If I were to ask you, what's the correlation between price of gold and the price and the movement of DJIA, which is the Dow Jones Industrial Average? What's the correlation between price of gold and the movement of DJIA? Negative? Very good. So the answer is, and the reason why it's negative is, you start purchasing gold Sorry, David, you can't. Let me see. Do I not have chat permissions? Sorry, can you not read my chats at all? Adam, you can see it. Eric, Eric, David, if you can't, um, you'll see where it says main room, the left panel. There's a set of permission bits, and the third one is called chat. And perhaps that's says chat permission off. If you click on it, it should toggle it to chat permission on. So in the main room section, if it's grayed out. So have you tried clicking it? Still no. Not working. Yes, I know. Sometimes it's a bit dodgy, this setup. Yes, I'm not. Well, so what I'm going to do is, I'm sorry, guys. Oh, you can't see anybody else's comments either. Sorry. Huh. That's interesting. No luck yet. Still can't see. You can? Perfect. Let me try one more. So, true. Gold signals a weak economy in contrast to the Dow. Can anybody spot that? Huh, true. Can everybody spot that? Cool. All right. So that's your correlation, right? So anyway, so that's the basics, and we'll do more correlation when we do it hands-on in class in the next couple of weeks or so. So going back to the question, so suppose you've been given results from 10 years of polling, customer or running market basket analysis, that customers who tend to purchase beer also tend to purchase diapers. And now, armed with that information, you've been asked to come up with shelving strategies for a particular store. So what would be your shelving strategy? So let me open a new page and let's see if I can possibly. So, all right, so let's see, suppose this is a store. Sorry guys, it's absolutely horrid. All right, so, and these are the aisles. All right, so Julie says opposite, Jamie says close together. All right, anybody else? So Jamie, would you like to specify where you'd keep, where would you put them, where you'd put them? So a few of you say together, a few of you say opposite. So close.
I would put them closer together, but then also when having them closer together, you can have targeted other purchase items within there that might be impulse purchases. So you can get specifically targeted, like you know that they're going to go and get beer, and you know that they're going to go and get diapers. If you have other impulse purchases that are within that same area, you might encourage those sales.
That's a very nice point. So you might put them close together, but put an impulse purchase items right out there where people, once they're there, they might likely just pick it up. Anybody else? All right, so you can have one of those end caps. All right, better selection. Oftentimes what stores typically do is, so the whole idea behind something like a store planning goes into what do you actually want customers to do when they are at a physical store? What do you want them to do? You buy items with the best margins, true, buy more, and what do they find as what's the correlation with purchasing more? So what correlates with purchasing more? What's your immediate correlation? So what's your immediate correlation with purchasing? All right, of course, that's the outcome of purchasing more, more revenue. But what gets people to purchase more, or what would you typically what would you tweak in order to get people to purchase more? Impulse, exposure to product, very nice. The first piece of the puzzle is spend more time in store. So the whole state of mind, true, and the whole idea, like sort of addressing all your bits and going to what Matthew just mentioned, force them to walk more. If you ever look at a store, and next time you visit a store, you'll see the type. Let me ask you, what kind of music does a store typically play? That's another perfect reason. I oftentimes like going to the one on Portage Path or whatever it is, the Giant Eagle Market District. Slow music, jazz, something, and they've found it over time. And later on, if you end up taking the course in operations with me, this was 1930s experimentation where they realized that the beat of the music changes how long you end up spending time out there. And true, depends on market demographics. That also tells you why companies such as this market district Giant Eagle now allows you to actually pour yourself a pint and take that pint and walk around the store. The whole idea behind that is slow the customer down so that they're likely to spend more time in the store. The more time you spend in the store, the greater the chance of whether you're using end capping or, they even use cup holders, right? This is called Market District Giant Eagle District, if I can ever spell something right. Giant Eagle, and it's Portage Path, and they have a fantastic beer selection too. I don't know if that's the one you're mentioning, but yes, the companies are doing that all the time. So in this case, the whole idea would be they try to place things opposite ends. The whole idea is, and they try to create a path so that you're likely to branch and go and find it because they know that you're likely to. No, this isn't in Hudson. This is in, I think it's Cuyahoga Falls or Akron or something like that. I don't know. The only store out there, the Giant Eagle in Hudson doesn't have. They might actually even have it. Who knows? Possibly. The one I'm talking about is really big, and they have like a proper draft selection, with like top notch draft beers. But the whole going back to this whole issue, the idea out there is to make sure that you're traversing the entire set before you're moving in, right? That before you're contemplating on making further purchases. So these are correlations. So the answer typically is, you'll find that they'll typically place it opposite ends of the store. Now somebody mentioned demographics, and just going back to that whole idea that there's, how do you make a group that otherwise would be impatient and just want to pick something up and leave? You suddenly add things such as what do you call it, shopping carts with a pint holder, a proper Starbucks where you can pick tea or coffee, even other food arrangements and so forth, like prepared food, so that you're spending more time. Same logic, you have the same information again, that there's a positive correlation between spending time and purchasing. Positive correlation between beer and diapers. How would you now use that same information if now Giant Eagle were to decide on going completely online? So, how would the same information, the question is, it's not just the insight, it's also how you end up acting on those insights. So, the physical store action that he proposes is a very interesting one. Typically, you try to um, force people to spend more time, but here's the thing, how would you now change your actions based on if Giant Eagle were to have its store design and go completely online? So Giant Eagle now has Giant Eagle online versus Giant Eagle physical. Giant Eagle physical, you have it opposite ends. What about Giant Eagle online? How would you do your shelving there, or how would you create a customer experience there, or make people purchase things there? Anyone? Yes, Jamie, Karen?
So online groceries, they are still being developed right now. Like none of them are really performing as they'd like. I know Amazon's definitely jumping into that field right now.
True.
Um, it. I think that they still haven't found what is going to actually get people in there and going to spend like they would if they had to physically shop for the groceries.
And the key piece of that puzzle, and you're so very right, and the issue there lies in the fact that customers, the minute the same customer changes their channel, which is moving from physical to online, they also change their purchasing behavior and purchasing strategy. Online, you rarely want to go in search of anything. Convenience, as Adam mentioned, becomes your primary objective, which basically means you now want to reduce the number of clicks the customer ought to go through in order to find beer in diapers. It's likely you're going to say that, by the way, we have this great deal on diapers while you're at the beer section online, or when you're at the diaper section online, you might say we've got this brilliant deal on beer. But in the process, you might also say, by the way, we also have certain deals, because what they look at, going back to what things like Amazon Recommender system does, is Amazon Recommender will try to look at common purchases between individuals, and then they'll also look at uncommon purchases between individuals. For example, if, exactly, as Julie mentioned, so let's assume Julie and Adam purchase the same book on Amazon, but they also purchase something else. Adam and Karen purchase the same book or the same other item on Amazon that Julie hasn't purchased, but they also purchase something else. So what they'll do is they'll take out the common set between those two, and they'll push in what Julie purchased as the other bit to Adam and Karen, and what Adam and Karen purchase as the other bit onto Julie. So the idea is trying to get them excited about what people that purchase this also tend to purchase as a mechanism to bundle. Just the way companies try to now trace if customers were to move from this section to the other section, what's likely to be the flow of the customer, and what ought to be the things we should place on the aisles that they're likely to cover in order to reach from point A to point B. So you're always trying to map out flow as a part of your analytical strategy. So going back to useful, so your market basket analysis is not just looking at association rules and correlation mechanisms, but it's also looking at what do you do now that you know the correlation. The other important thing to remember about correlation is not causation. Correlation only tells you what things happen together. Doesn't automatically mean that because you do this, you will do something else. If you can know that, if once you can figure out that because somebody purchases that, then they will purchase this, there's an order to it. So correlation doesn't have an order associated with it. In correlation, it says two things happen. Does one trigger the purchase of the other? Does the other trigger the purchase of one? We don't know. However, if you can find out the trigger, you now know what is going to be the right scent that's going to drive somebody to come to the store anyway. So for example, assume you knew that beer is what brings people to the store, and only when they purchase beer do they purchase diapers. If they don't purchase beer, they're not going to purchase diapers. Then you know that, all right, all I need to know, if I know that beer is actually the cause for the purchase of diapers, I'm now going to subtly entice people to come in with a special beer deal or whatever it is, because we know that they can come in with this great beer deal, but then we are going to increase the margin on diaper sales because we know that that is their gateway drug. So the beer is the gateway drug. Once they come in to purchase that, they're likely to purchase the next bit, and we can now increase our margin on the next piece of the puzzle. And that becomes a key ingredient. And as we move from in the next few weeks, as we move from understanding things like correlation to understanding causation, what causes what, we will start getting more and more into prediction models where we'll start thinking of what causes certain things. Everybody all right in terms of what we're talking about? Does that make sense? Is that utterly useless, stupid, rubbish, boring? None of the above, hopefully. Any questions, guys? No? All right. Fair enough. Thank you very much. So let's go into something called churn analysis. Thank you very much. Let's go into churn analysis. So churn analysis, when you talk about churn is a huge issue, which basically asks you, why isn't it that all our browsers are converted into buyers? So as we speak, especially at a retail level, even at a wholesale inter-organizational B2B exchange level, there's always this thing that, why is it that people ask for information but never made a purchase? Why is it that people clicked on all these products and sometimes even added them onto a shopping cart, but never actually checked out those pieces? That kind of analysis is called a churn analysis, where they try to look at predictive modeling in terms of what are the probabilities and the reasons for customer attrition, which is discontinuing and not repeating purchases. So customer churn is a measure of customer retention, given that the cost of retaining a customer is considerably lower than attracting a new customer. And churn rate is calculated as percentage of repeat customers per period. Churn analysis, by the way, churn rate is also calculated in terms of the amount of missing customers from browsing to buying, from browsing to carting, from carting to purchasing. Because this can now tell you about customer traits. Segments, is it because they couldn't find information? Did they spend a lot of time on a page? Did they look at competing products and services? Uh, did information about competing products and services increase confusion, because of which they couldn't really make up their mind? And that's why companies will oftentimes especially create single threads while you're on a session, right? Or while they call it a session every time you're visiting a page. They try and look at the time you're spending on a certain page, on a certain product. And internally, there's an algorithm that says that if the percentage is spending more than whatever it is, 2 minutes on this particular page and still haven't added something to a cart, or hasn't added something to a cart, possibly pop up a message saying that, would you like some help with the purchase, or do you have some questions about the item? This all come from things like churn analysis, because they try and predict customer behavior, and they realize that if somebody is spending more than 30 seconds, the the chance or the probability that they're going to make a purchase increases. However, if the time that they're spending on the page is more than 3 minutes, possibly, the probability of making a purchase decreases. So, little time spent is good, too much time spent is bad. And they know that this is oftentimes a trigger where too much time spent on a page is automatically a sign that not all is quiet on the Western Front, and possibly that you need some kind of an intervention. And the system itself will intervene and say that, do you want some help with it? And if you say yes, guess what? A chat session is going to open up, or something similar will happen where they'll try to solve the issue altogether. Make sense, guys? Does that make sense? Good. Thank you very much. So the next one is something called break-even analysis and contribution margin. So let's talk a little bit, because this is a very, very important piece of analytics, and very important for everyone to know, even as you're solving different things. True, and you'll always see that companies like AT&T will always try to upsell you something, because anytime you're there, the idea is, if you're visiting, if you're ever sort of browsing, it's likely that you might be interested. If you're interested, perhaps they should ask you if they could offer you a certain service or a certain product, or come up with an interesting discounting for you based on how long you've been a customer and all that stuff, to solve the issue, which is basically all they want to do is reduce churn. So yes, but see, that also can, to a certain degree, change your entire. This is called, when Jamie mentions that you might want to move from AT&T to Verizon, this is called a switching behavior. And that again is that very thin line customers have to, or companies have to tread or traverse, because a little bit of attention is good. If you suddenly feel like too much attention is being tantamount to smothering, it's likely that they're going to be empty nesters very soon. And it's important for companies to figure out exactly what defines providing some attention, and at what point of time does attention turn into smothering behavior. So, going back to this bit, break-even analysis, contribution margin, two very important piece of the puzzle. Anybody knows what contribution margin is? So two very important pieces to know. One is, of course, thank you very much, gross margin and contribution margin. So what's gross margin? So gross margin is sales revenue minus cost of sales, right? So nowadays they call it cost of sales rather than cost of goods sold, the previous bit. used to be called costs of goods sold. Nowadays they call it cost of sales because it could be sales of a service, but there isn't really a cost of goods sold for a service. So, but there's a cost of service. So gross margin is that. So the margin, it's called a margin because it's a ratio. And a ratio, therefore, a margin, therefore, would be your gross sales. So it would be gross profit divided by revenue, which would therefore be your gross margin. A margin always by default, do remember this, and I know most of you know that already. We covered it last class, good. And contribution margin is cost minus, revenue minus, so I'll just do a quick recap. Revenue minus variable costs. Now, could you remind me if we covered break-even calculations? Did we cover break-even? No? Yes? Oh, we did cover break-even, right? And if I were to ask you, you did it in your last accounting class. All right, fantastic. So let's do so if I were to give you something in terms of a quick break-even point, so suppose I just I'll do a quick take because this is I think it's a very, very important metric anyway in the process, but you'd be able to tackle it, right? Perfect. So quick bit is break-even point is you typically calculate it as fixed costs divided by contribution margin. That's your basic calculation, and everybody knows how to get it. I'm not going to do an exercise or anything like that, just a very basic coverage because again these are important things and sometimes a little bit of recap is good. So break even, basically you're asking how many units or how many services should I sell in order for me to start making money. So your basic setup is revenue per unit of good or service, right, times the number of goods or services is equal to nothing but fixed costs of producing those goods and services plus variable costs per unit times number of units. Right, guys? That's your general structure. Which basically means if you want to, sorry, this is right, fair enough. So in this case, all you're doing is revenues times number of units minus, so you're bringing the variable costs over, VC times number of units is equal to fixed costs. Everybody clear to this point? All I did was move this bit to the left, which basically means if you take number of units, you factor that out, number of units, you have revenues minus variable costs, which is equal to fixed costs, which means if you're solving for number of units, it's basically fixed costs divided by revenues minus variable costs, right? I should put in brackets because they're together. And we know that revenue minus variable costs is equal to, because revenue minus variable costs is equal to contribution margin. Your BEP is nothing but fixed costs divided by contribution margin. Everybody clear on that part? Lovely. Thank you very much, guys. And if, of course, if you have any questions, the idea is to build synergy across different courses so that, it starts making sense as you're preparing that, right? Or trying to figure these things out. So, uh, going back onto it, so in this case, all you need to therefore know is what would be the fixed costs and what exactly would be the variable costs. But going back into this whole mechanism, it's also important for you to suddenly start making sense out of these break-even points. That why is it that restaurants and bars are typically, and taverns and so forth, are typically the ones that pop up like mushroom and also disappear very, very, very quickly? And the response is because most of them never ever figure out what their break-even point setups are. You'll see that there are the companies that typically go under the quickest, the restaurants, are the ones that have these very colorful menus spanning many, many pages, which also sends you a signal that these are companies that are also carrying a lot of inventory without really knowing what's the demand for the inventory that you're carrying in the process. More inventory increases fixed costs. More inventory also increases variable costs because every time a customer once in a while asks for a certain thing, you now have to do a full preparation and a full set. Therefore, your break-even point at which you're actually breaking even suddenly goes up dramatically, and it becomes very difficult to fulfill it. While the restaurants that really do well will typically are typically more upscale, will have a very small menu, have a much more boutique feel to it, whether it's a Michelin star where you don't even decide what you want. You're supposed to be coming in for hot cuisine that is defined by the chef, who will tell you exactly what you will get as a series of culinary delights of sorts. And you'll also see places, whether you're going to Lola's or Dante's or even downtown 140 in Hudson, it's a one-page menu, which means keep your fixed costs low, keep your inventory low, keep your variable costs low. By virtue of that, your break-even point automatically is going to be pressed lower in the process. Clear on that part? Yes? All right. Thank you very much. Guys, I'm terribly sorry, but do you want to take a 5-minute break and then we'll carry on and finish it in the next 30 minutes or so? And then I might even chance upon you because I've got to head over to Kent for the operations course. I don't know, do you have distance learning today afternoon? Oh, lovely. So I'm not going to see you, but anyway, I'll catch you. Cool. All right. Even better. You'll get to get a tiny bit of respite. Cheers. All right. Cool. Thank you, guys. I'm stepping out for a second. So we're carrying on, and the next bits to cover are as follows. When we're talking about these analytics concepts that are useful, the whole idea is these are very popular metrics that are in play. If you start looking at each of these metrics, you can now start thinking of in terms of what are the things that actually add value to this. Or for example, if you're talking about break-even points, what are the characteristics that could reduce our break-even point? Because you want to reduce your break-even point. Reduction in break-even point basically means that you can start making money earlier on. The same story goes with payback period. So you use these as a mechanism to ask yourselves in your company, in your team, in your functional role or corporate role, that how is it that I can reduce my payback period? How is it that I can increase my return on investments? How is it that I can increase my net present value, future value of money, and future value, and so forth? So payback period will try tackling this pretty swiftly because I think you've got a good sense of what they are. So payback period is the time that it takes to recoup an investment. If you were to get money or borrow money, so it's important for us to understand the nuances of it. What are the different ways that a company can raise money? Anyone? So if your company wanted to start a project, what are the different ways you could raise money? Very good. You could have IPO. You could borrow money. Which is borrowing money is nothing but debt structuring. Bonds, right? Bonds also a type of a debt structuring. In this case, you're promising somebody a certain yield. So you'd issue a bond, you're promising somebody a certain yield. If that yield is becoming, and they think there's a certain riskiness, reward that comes with it, they're likely to borrow. Very important in the process is understanding your basic structuring, which is capital structuring. And your capital structuring basically tells you what, to a certain degree, what's your debt to your equity. And we're not going to get into all the nuances of debt to equity, but it's still very important to just quickly cover that idea. And the nuance between debt and equity is that debt is, of course, you can raise it, you can borrow money from somebody else, but there's a note that comes with it, and you're borrowing on a note, which means there's a constant interest expense that comes with it. However, the key to whether you're going to choose debt, or whether you're going to go the way of debt, or you're going to go the way of equity. So it's typically called a D to E ratio. So your debt to equity ratio. Equity, on the other hand, doesn't require an expense. However, it automatically increases the dilution of or it dilutes the amount of ownership that you have in a certain bit. It also means that you're also open to, or you're exposed or vulnerable to the caprices of the general public, as well as big institutions, and whether it's somebody who's a Wall Street analyst or someone who's basically posting a blog post on any kind of these street blogging, financial street blogging. So it's key for you to realize that your payback period, therefore, is also going to be dependent on not only how well you perform, but how well you understand how you're going to structure your capital and the investment that you're typically going to get. Now, this automatically brings us to something called a key thing that you hear all the time in your companies, and you run it all the time anyway, which is what we call as return on investment. It's nothing but the value of an investment based on the ratio of the investment value and the investment cost, right? So return on investment is nothing but your total investment benefits minus total investment costs divided by your total investment costs. So if I were to ask you, if you have a project that has an expected return of 5% and and a debt interest of 6%, would you invest? Would you start the project? Don't do it, right? And the whole idea is that as long as your project's return is 5%, you don't really want to, unless it's breaking. Now, the key behind this is realizing two different things, which is this 6%, both of them are compounding over time. And as you're looking at the compounding bit, you know that you're losing 1 percentage point year on year at a compounding rate. And you would say that, truly, I don't really want to do it. Now, as you look at this set, if you now were to say, all right, my expected return was 5% in the first year, and then 10% in the second year, and 8% in the third year, and 4% in the fifth year, would you now do it? And we're not going to get into the specifics of it, but the general structure would be you'd end up using something called the net present value. Because all you're going to do is you basically, again, we're not going to get into total depths of it, but your typical setup is, in this case, is, let's see if I can get this to work. Your net present value is going to be nothing but what you've spent, right? Initial investment minus returns over time. And that itself will say that, all right, which is equal to initial, let's say, so let's call it initial investment minus, this is nothing but the future value you're going to get times 1 plus I, which is, and anybody, what's I? What's I to the power of negative n? I is your interest. Now, typically, what would you choose as your interest before we move forward? So it's going to be key, right? So n is nothing but let's say, let's make the easiest bit there. So in this case, n is number of periods, and I is the discount rate or the interest rate. And what would you choose as? What would be your choice of discount rate? So if I were to ask you that tomorrow you're setting up a new project and you want to get your project approved, and you have to typically show them that your project's going to end up giving you a positive return on the investment. And in order for you to show that, you have to figure out, apart from how much money you're going to make over time, what would be your choice of interest rate, and where are you going to get that number from? Anyone? Any idea where you're going to get your number from for choosing your interest rate? What's going to get very good? So one, of course, is your weighted average cost of capital, which is nothing but it's the weight of what makes up that investment, whether it's debt, the cost of debt, the cost of equity, the cost of preferred stocks, and so forth, to cover that, all right? And so that's one mechanism, in order, assuming you have to typically get a completely fresh new investment to get that bit done. oftentimes you can also use things like, let me see if I can write it there, things like your IRR, which is your company might have its own internal rates of return that they want you to fulfill. You might say that you might get it, you might be able to get capital at a cheaper rate, but we typically want projects that at least internal, let's say, rate of return. We typically want to have a project that at least matches our internal rate of return, because with the cost of capital, as long as your project's return is greater than your weighted average cost of capital, you should say, sure, we should go ahead with it. But sometimes some companies would add a stipulation on top of that and say that you at least have to match our internal rate of return. The other, oftentimes, if you don't really have a number, including your weighted average cost of capital, and you still want to decide on something. So if you don't have a number, if you don't have a number on hand, you can now use, any idea what you would use? If you don't have a number, you can use what? What would be some of your recommendations? So suppose I come to you, a supplicant for information, asking you, we really don't have a weighted average cost of capital number because we really don't know, but we need to know what's the opportunity cost of choosing this project versus some other project, and we can't really figure out exactly what our discount rate ought to be. What would you sort of advise if I were to ask you that question? What should I choose as your discount rate, or as my discount rate? Anyone? Come on, somebody please. Very good. One option is average stock market returns. So you could say that, I just want to look at how the S&P 500 performs over a long period of term. And if you say that already it performs at 8.25%, you say, there's my opportunity cost. I could just put my money into something like SPX, which is nothing but an index fund or an ETF version of S&P 500, and not worry about that. You could use a bank interest rate, but here's the interesting bit about a bank interest rate is you could say that's an interest rate, but it's an interest rate that's also floating, which basically means that interest rate is likely to might change in the short term, in the long term, with the change in administration, whether a different policy is made based on based on what Janet Yellen would say, or whoever the new Treasury Secretary is going to be affirmed as is going to mention. So bank interest rates basically are very, very good point, but they might be much more volatile. So the other option, therefore, is, so these are all good options: S&P, bank interest rates. So as Adam mentioned, the S&P bit, as Shiko mentions, the bank interest rate. The other option is, and I can't even write properly out here, so sorry if I'm fumbling around. The other option is using treasuries. Sorry, not treasuries, but treasuries. Mainly because a typical 10-year note gives you a general idea of stability in terms of inflation. So all you're saying is, I might not want to use the money, but if I don't use the money, because, and again, bank interest rate, think of it. What's the yield on a treasury? And the yield on a treasury typically is what? What's the treasury yield right now? About 2.5%. So about 2.5%. What's a bank interest rate? Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's about 2.5%. And bank interest rate is about half a percentage point. So you're saying that, so in this case, if you were to choose a half a percentage point, what you're basically saying is, if I were to keep my money aside for that I'd assigned to a project, the value of my money itself is depreciating over time. But for you to show that it's not at least going to deflate, because time will pass and the time value of money is going to make the, the value of the money go lower and lower and lower over time. I at least need to figure something that is inflation adjusted. And what's the only piece that's inflation adjusted? The response is it's typically a treasury yield on a 10-year note or something like that. So oftentimes you could use that as your benchmark discount rate if you're ever making that calculation. Or, of course, if you want to become more conservative, the next bit is look at what your debt interest would have been. Third level is look at your weighted average cost of capital. The fourth and the most conservative, which typically also means it's a higher discount rate, is typically your internal rate of return. So it's important to pay attention to choosing these sets, because just by choosing a different rate, you could make the numbers look completely different. And you already know that very well. Everybody clear on that part? Yes? All right. Splendid. We won't talk about scheduled performance index. We might talk about it later when we branch onto doing scheduled predictions and so forth. We've talked about gross margin and net margin. By the way, we talked about gross margin, and could somebody quickly remind me what gross margin is? Anyone? Quick reminder. Very good. Profit minus costs of goods sold, and you're always trying to push down your costs. So it's always costs, right? It's COGS, which is the cost of goods sold, and it's important for you to push the cost down. What's net margin? And the minute it's margin, it automatically means it's a ratio. It's a ratio, it's a ratio. Remember, anytime it's a margin, it's always a ratio. What's a net margin then? The net margin, or net margin in this case, is nothing but your net income after taxes, right? So this is typically EBIT. Some companies will be a bit more conservative and say we want it to be EBITDA, which is earnings before income, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, and that makes you a bit more conservative, divided by your total revenues. Now, an interesting take on that metric, which might even be interesting for you and might be insightful for your own companies, would be to start looking at EBIT divided by, or sorry, net margin divided by your gross margin, to see how good you are at expense management. See, gross margin tells you how good you are at cost management. But after you've got your gross margin, you've got your gross profit, after which all your expenses go into effect. And then from that you get your net profit, from which you take away your interest expenses and taxes and all that depreciation, amortization, to get your final net profit. But it doesn't really, neither of them separately tells you whether your net margin or your gross margin is a good idea of, or gives you good insights in terms of how good are you at expense management. So if you were to now divide net margin by gross margin, it's going to subtly show you to what extent, or you say gross margin minus net margin divided by gross margin. It'll subtly give you a much better sense in terms of how good are you at really managing your expenses, even though you've been typically good at managing your costs. So it's very, very important. Um, the rest of them are not too worried tremendously about them. We'll revisit them over time. Mm, The other thing I want to talk to you about, but we'll not get into tremendous detail except when we start talking about predictive modeling and so forth, is something called is probability distribution. And we'll talk about it briefly, and I'll talk about it a bit more in length for your next distance learning set where I'll post something. But a key in that of puzzle is something called, so if I were to, again, let's go and just hit it directly. If I were to ask you what exactly is a probability distribution, or what defines a probability distribution, what exactly is even what is probability? Probability is nothing but the chance of something happening, right? And if you know that probability is a chance of happening, probability distribution is nothing but the chance of something happening when you take into perspective all things happening, right? So if you say that, all right, what is the chance that, or what is the probability distribution of having a good career, or enhancing your career after an EMBA? You'd say, all right, is this probability distribution going to be something that is normally distributed? Is it going to be a skewed distribution, which is, will it look lopsided? Will it be not lopsided? Will it be, so so again, Jamie, what is the birthday problem or paradox? Would you mind telling us what that is?
Yeah, so basically, the birthday problem paradox means that even though there are 365 days in a year, you could have 365 people in a room, but you're going to have a lot of birthdays that are closely that are grouped together, and you're going to not find that everybody is going to have a day across the board.
That's a very, thank you very much, Jamie. That's a very nice take on it. So oftentimes what you'll find is this distribution, which means more, even though there might be many people in the room, it's not going to be distributed uniformly, which is, if you have 365 people in a room, and there are, say, 365 days in a year, you could say that, truly, it's likely that everyone would be born on a single, each of the single day, and that would make it a uniform distribution. If you were to now plot it in terms of days of the year in the x-axis and number of people born on that certain day on the y-axis, it should be a straight line, assuming it were purely perfect set. But the probability distribution shows that there is a weird paradox to it, which is, even though you have 365 people and there are 365 days of a year, or you can even have the population of the world, 365 days a year, it's not going to be uniform. There's going to be a crest where there's a probability that more people were born on certain days or during a certain period than others. And it subtly changes the way we look at things, which basically becomes an important piece of the puzzle. So let's try and make a managerial implication of it. Now that you know the birthday paradox, suppose you're a store that focuses on birthday sales, or sales, focused on birthday-like events. Would you prepare yourself exactly the same way that you would for every single day of the year? And the answer is no. Once you know what the probability distribution is, you might find that loads of people ended up being born for, I'll just make up a specific set, between the times of, I don't know, August to October. So August to October is prime season for people being born based on your probability distribution, which basically would mean that given that you're now armed with that information, you'll say that I'm now going to stock up more things because there's likely to be more demand for birthday related material between the times of August to October, and the other times I'm going to run some interesting sales because there's a lower probability of people having very high demand for birthday things at that point of time. So it changes the way you even define how you want to place items, how you want to deal with items, how you want to price items. And of course, as we always know, high demand basically means you want to dampen it by also increasing your margin, right? So that you don't do a run out at one point of time and you're suddenly overstocked the other parts of the time. So most of the time, we assume that as we are moving into a population, it is normally distributed, which is things move right into the middle, and there are two tail ends where things are likely to happen less. The final bit, just to finish off, is something called is it always true? So if I were to ask you, now look at 365 people that you've invited at a party, that they will follow the same probability distribution, the same angle of curve that you would have if you looked at the entire population? And the answer is no. It's likely because it's a small sample. The question that is the eternal question in sampling is, which we talked about in class last time, is does the sample truly represent the population? And the answer is the sample typically does not truly represent the population unless the sample is large enough so that it starts mimicking the population, which means that as you're moving from sample to population, what is truly the most clustered number of birthdays? So assume clustered number of birthdays, as we mentioned, was between August and October. As we truly move, so when you bring in 365 people for an event, you might find that in that group, the birthdays were more towards between April and September. So that's where the peak lies. And however, as you move closer and closer to getting more and more and more people together, it's going to now tend more and more towards August to September. Just the way we talk about truly the probability of getting a head or a tail is 50%. But if you were to sort of toss a coin once, you might just get a tail. Try it next time, you might get a tail again. Try the third time, you now might get a head, which is 2 out of 3 times, which is 66.66% of the time, you're getting a tail, and only 33% of the time you're getting a head. Now, try it multiple times. As you increase the number of times you try tossing the coin, you'll see that the probabilities of landing heads versus probabilities of landing tails will really start moving towards something called the central limit theorem. Start moving right into the middle and become 50%. And that oftentimes is the crux. By the way, thank you very much, guys. Any kind of, so I've tried to record this. I've tried to record it on 2 different sets, and including one, and I'll see which one works. I love to do these redundant bits because thank you very much, guys. Have a wonderful weekend. Miss you, chaps, and I'm looking forward to meeting you physically. I'll have the projects. I'll have the first exercise graded in by tomorrow, and I'll always send you an email once I've graded them. And till then, enjoy, and looking forward to our next discussion. Bye, guys. Take care. Enjoy the day. Cheers. Causation, prediction, and correlation or association. Let's look at the difference between causation and correlation. Association and correlation versus prediction. So, association is basically when two things happen together. Correlation is exactly the same thing. That how do you come up with a good analytical metric that would look at the level of association? So, correlation is nothing but the strength of association. Prediction, on the other hand, it requires you to understand causes and effects. Now, do realize associations and correlations do not automatically mean that just because there is a relationship, a correlation, that there is automatically a causality. So it could have, two things might happen at the same time. They could simply be coincidental, but coincidences don't automatically translate into a cause. The minute we assume or we force a cause onto a coincidence, we start turning superstitious. So, primary cause assessments, you ask yourself these questions. What draws customers to a store? Now, of course, you could say that, a customer is drawn to a store because the presence of other customers, or it could simply be coincidental. Now, if you say that it was actually because of the presence of some other customers, you have to prove that it was that the previous customers arrived first, and because of that, consistently and reliably, the next stream of customers arrive. If it isn't the case, or if that isn't the case, then it becomes very problematic, proving that it is a causality versus just a correlation. Similarly, what leads to churn? Churn is when customers don't convert from being browsers to buyers, which means that you might have customers that just go onto a website and search for a variety of items, but at the end of the day, they don't end up purchasing anything. Same thing in a store. A customer or many customers walk in, they look at what's there, they just browse through things and never ever end up purchasing anything. So, in order to understand why there is churn, you could simply say, well, there is a correlation between whether the customers are looking at other websites and comparing their prices to my own prices, because of which there is churn. Well, that could be a causality, that could also be a correlation. Or you could also say that, well, customers generally are looking at things that are higher priced and they might need a longer time to make a decision. Similarly, there are things such as conversion rate, which is this to a certain degree, it's the opposite of churn, which is how quickly do you convert a browser to a buyer. So a lot of these have both correlational elements or association rules as well as causal rules. Similarly, what drives patient satisfaction? Is it the patient satisfaction? You could say that, the patient satisfaction depends upon how quickly they are attended to by a physician or a nurse, or how quickly the check-in or the check-out happens, or how efficient the billing is. These are all likely to be causal. But then, if it is causal, which one of these has the greatest impact? Wherein is the sequence of care delivery? So how do you set up a sequence of care delivery so that the patients actually have the best satisfaction? Which prices should be discounted and which should be increased? Who is likely to be a credit risk? Who is likely to repay the fastest? We find that many places in the world don't have a mechanism to gauge credit scores, and it is becoming quite incumbent upon existing economies as well as other companies and other multinationals that are working in these different countries where there isn't a formal credit scoring mechanism to figure out what are the other correlational factors that seem to affect somebody paying things quicker. And oftentimes, because they don't have a long history of individuals and how quickly they're paid into a single governmental database like we do, it sometimes becomes very difficult. So they start looking at other things like uh, cellular payments, if they are very popular in those countries. How quickly do people pay there? How quickly are funds transferred? To actually convert what starts up with a correlation into something that is going to be causal. Based on that, then it can now say that, well, over time we can reliably assess that if people do a certain thing like pay their taxi drivers or pay their bills right on time via their cell phones or their cellular phones, then there is a very high likelihood that this person is also going to end up paying general bills on time and might pose to be a bit of a low credit risk. So there are mechanisms where in the absence of data, oftentimes you have to start with correlation and then move into causality. Which business activity is likely to incur greater costs in the future? On what machines should you practice planned maintenance, which are more likely to fail? Which services should you roll out and which should you draw down? What inventory might show increased or decreased activity? What are the downstream effects of pricing? Are there things called price waterfalls and things such as bundling, which is how do you end up selling things together? How do you end up sort of unbundling things that is, for example, rather than selling a full album of music, you sell individual music. That's unbundling. But pricing is a cofactor. And if you look at this graph just beside you, you'll see that what we intend as the initial sales price and what we actually end up creating something called a pocket price, which is the price that actually we end up with at the end of the day. What we want to sell it for versus what we end up selling for are quite different animals. And a proper pricing, therefore, would get you closer to what you're likely to sell for rather than what you simply estimate that it's going to sell for in the future. So these are all issues related to correlation and causation. And correlation, again, is a much more standardized measurement of association rules between two things, while causation is a mechanism to predict that what are the things that actually cause other things to happen. Strategic use of analytics. Well, there are many different use of analytics, and let's look at a few of them. First, a huge area of analytics is something called text mining, which is you're trying to build patterns from text and narrations. Freeform text such as email, news article, tweets, blog posts, text messages. You're saying these things happen all the time. Every time we even make a phone call to customer service at a company, your phone call is logged and it's converted into text. And from those phone calls and those texts, they're trying to decipher what seem to be the common issues, how not only how quickly are they resolved, but what is the process of resolution. Are there certain bits that can be tackled a priori so that you don't end up overwhelming a call center support system? Behind these are things such as sentiment and relationship analysis. Google AdWords and AdSense oftentimes will use some of these things to understand sentiments. If you're sending out an email saying, I'm sick and tired of my printer not working, it's quite likely that in the background, Google AdSense is basically passing out your emails, or if you're saying that, if you're on your Google Home Mini or Amazon Echo saying, Amazon or Google Home, okay, Google, can you do me a favor and tell me some of the best quality printers that are being sold right now, it'll automatically convert that into a text, and based on that, it'll try and figure out that you might actually be wanting a printer. And the next time you're online, it's going to push forward an ad for a printer just for you. So what they're trying to understand is not only understand what you're saying, but also gauge your sentiment. Do you actually like it? Do you somewhat like it? To what extent do you think you might be interested in talking to somebody else about it? Do you actually need it, or do you simply want it? And these are sometimes nuances in our emotions and our own understanding and speech that they're always trying to convert first into text and then mine that text using analytics to figure out certain, based on certain precepts, what your idea or what your inclinations might be in the near term and in the long term. Another area is called social network analysis, graph theory. Graph theory is basically nothing but plotting out a combination of communication between multiple different nodes. Now, what you're doing is you're assessing information and communication patterns via centrality, transmitters and receivers. So if you're looking at how we connect in this world, from how we make friends on Facebook or on Google Plus or on Twitter, it gives you a sense of which ones are the people that are the influences, and these are known as influence maps. If you look at the picture to the side, you'll suddenly see there are these big balloon-like setups which might show that they're the ones who ask the most number of questions or retweet the most number of things. These are the people who actually come up with the most number of things. These are the types of people who tend to read those things. Now, social network analysis is becoming core to especially political strategy because they're trying to look at who are the influences and how good is their influence and how is that working. So even Facebook tries to find out patterns. In telecom, thrifty customers are the most influential because they'll post a lot of things saying that, well, this is not good, that's not good, it cost me money here and there, and that might oftentimes dissuade or even persuade other customers to join in. Influential customers make longer calls and receive shorter but multiple calls, and that's what's been found. Same thing, the capture of Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, and that led to his demise, was found by mapping the social network of his chauffeurs. Once they could realize that these are the people that drive him, and based on how they were communicating amongst themselves, they created a social network map. And from that, they could triangulate where Saddam Hussein is likely to be found because he was in hiding somewhere around Tikrit or something like that, his hometown, after he was deposed with the US coalition attack in Iraq early in 2000s. So social network analysis oftentimes is a fantastic analytical tool that you can use to find out patterns of influence, patterns of information transmission, centrality, or the ones who are co-people, and figure out things before they are likely to happen. So analytics cases, let's talk about metrics because that's what it is. One of the most important part is if you understand what you want to measure and how you should be measuring it in order to achieve the right outcome, you're already halfway into your planning point where you know that I know my outcome very well. I also know how to exactly measure my outcome. Therefore, now I can plot out how to create or how to understand the issues that impact them. But if you don't know your destination, it's likely you won't know the path that will take you to your destination. So store-to-store comparisons, you compare store with different characteristics, units sold per customer, revenue per transaction, number of items per basket, etc. Player-to-player comparison, analytics finds that the corner three pointer is the most efficient shot in basketball. But see, this basically tells you that in this case you're measuring the efficiency of a shot, and you've got to realize, how do I measure efficiency of a shot, which basically means what is the probability that shots taken from that particular point of a basketball court is likely to end up creating a point for the particular team. And that's when they find that something called the corner three pointer is likely to be the most important placement or the location from which a successful shot can be made. Now that suddenly becomes a very interesting issue, or a very interesting piece for the various basketball teams that are using analytics, and they would say, all right, let's make our players work in such a way and strategize the game so that most of our locational shots end up being from a corner three pointer. Therefore, we're likely to have the most number of points in the game. So in 2006, Miami Heat signed Shane Battier, a forward averaging only 10 points per game. But advanced metrics showed Battier was an outstanding player due to his fine defense and shot selection. Choosing the right players to guard and to support stars LeBron James and Dwayne Wade, they won 2 straight championships. Poor statistics also on the other hand, end up using poor metrics, such as win shares to capture defense. So that's capture defense, rebounding, avoiding turnover, and taking good shots. So NBA teams still give huge contracts to players like Carmelo Anthony, a so-called ball stopper, because he does not pass enough. As the NBA coach Mike D'Antoni says, we're still stuck in thinking that the best players are ball stoppers, and it's got to change. So understand that knowing what your outcome is oftentimes important. If you think that being a ball stopper is your main outcome, then you end up choosing and hiring the wrong or paying for the wrong players while not winning games. But if you understand that playing mainly in a way so that you can create the best locational advantage, such as a corner three pointer, then what you can do is you can suddenly choose players that are the best at creating that particular locational setup, and therefore win the game. Metrics. Going forward, metrics are often KPIs, or key performance indicators. What are they in terms of what they do to the organization? Which is basically metrics' job would be to simply be able to trace the right outcome so that you can use them as a performance indicator that are key to your survival and your competitive advantage. They're also critical success factors because they can lead you to success. They're called CSFs. So KPIs and CSFs oftentimes underpin metrics, or even mainly underscore metrics. So some important parameters for choosing metrics are as follows. Firstly, metrics should be reliable, which is be consistent over multiple tests and over time, and valid, which is they must be meaningful, they must mean something, and they should be measurable, and they should also be consistent in their measure over time. If they are very variant, then you really don't know if that metric was the right choice or not. Metrics should offer the best impact and improvement. Metrics should reflect the mission, vision, and values of the company. Something that ties into, because if you end up choosing a metric that really does not work very well with the mission and the values of the company, then what's likely is that you're not going to have any kind of executive championship. Metrics should be driven by measurable evidence, so you should be able to measure it. Metrics should be simple to collect and analyze. Metrics should have more than one dimension. So oftentimes, if you think of any metric, for example, how well does a company perform? What are the different ways you can measure it? You could of course say that, well, I want to measure it in terms of how much the company's earnings are. You could say that, well, earnings are a good measure, but they're not the only measure, because earnings come after things like interest, taxes, depreciation, and all that stuff. But those are also numbers that are dependent on which country or which locality is giving you better tax advantages, whether you're being able to strategize on your depreciation schedule and make it look like you're losing the value of your assets quicker. And those are very interesting pieces. On the other hand, somebody might say, well, then we should also look at a company performance in terms of its earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Somebody could say that, well, the other ways to look at it is how well it manages its costs, therefore look at its gross profit. So there are multiple different ways. Somebody could say that, well, we want to look at the price of the change in equity of the company or the price of the equity in the open market. So there are multiple different ways to measure, and oftentimes it is important for you to not only know these dimensions but also see how these dimensions correlate between one another before you jump onto any conclusions about which metric to choose. Then metrics should try to offer complete information. It is important to not use absolute values, but consider ratios as metrics. For example, converting a fraction into a percentage creates a common floor or zero and a ceiling of 100, therefore standardizing the data. So you could say that, well, my gross profit is $100,000. If you say my gross profit is $100,000, another company's gross profit is $80,000, does that automatically mean that the company with $100,000 has a better way of managing its costs? Not necessarily, because you want to look at what percentage of sales is your gross profit, or you want to look at your gross profit, which is you want to look at your gross profit margin. So if you say that one company sold $200,000 worth of products and had $100,000 gross profit, and the other company sold $120,000 worth of products and had $80,000 in gross profit, the second company suddenly, by using ratios, the second company is actually doing better because its gross margin is better. Similarly, metrics should be assessed for changes over time. You should look at how metrics are changing over time. Just don't look at it as a snapshot as a snapshot, but look at it as something that is dynamic and changes over time, to look at the trend in the metrics. And then metrics should be auditable for accuracy and transparency. So you should be able to make sure that you can trace the origin of the metric. You can trace all the numbers, where the numbers came from that make up the metric, so that you can test for accuracy and transparency. So metrics, trying to align or the unit level of analysis with proper metrics. The unit of analysis can be at the corporate level, the division level, the functional level, the task level, or even the individual level. So you've got to choose where the level of your analysis and the unit of your analysis. And the unit of your analysis could very well be anything from whether it's percentage, if it's temperature, it could be anything from Celsius to Fahrenheit to Kelvin. If it's a profit, it could be a percentage as a ratio or a margin. It could be a dollar value. If you're looking at how much market share you have, it could be as a percentage. So make sure that your unit of analysis is not only at the right unit of where you measure it, or right level of where you measure it, but also has the right unit associated with it. There's a story in a very famous philosophical farce called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where a planet in the far end of the galaxy wanted to show that it's extremely sustainable, and they chose tree leaves, as a measure of as a part of their currency. That was their choice of metric. Now, of course, what happened then is they were hailed as being extremely sustainable and very nice, and they've done a fantastic job. But later on, they just realized, well, leaves keep growing all the time. Trees keep growing more and more and more leaves, which means their currency kept on creating more currency over time. Now, whenever you create too much currency, it leads to massive amounts of inflation. And more leaves were creating more inflation because their currency were based on or was based on leaves. So, what the same the planet in the galaxy ended up doing is the one that one chose leaves to become sustainable had to cut down trees to make sure that their inflation was in check. And that oftentimes is the importance of choosing proper metrics. If you choose the wrong one, you're going to be left with things that you don't want to do in both the short term and long term. So, here are some popular metrics in different industry functions. Healthcare, things such as the structural metrics, such as ratios of physicians to admitted patients, process metrics, such as percentage of patients completing preventative or follow-up treatments, outcome metrics, such as survival rate for cardiac arrests, experience metrics, such as negative to positive feedback ratios, lab turnaround time, average ER wait time, average length of stay. In operations, there are productivity metrics such as output to input, yield metrics which are such as percentage of quality finished products from work in progress without scrap or rework, percentage of customer returns, throughput metrics such as number of completed products per time period, MTBF or mean time between failure metrics, capacity utilization, which is capacity used by available capacity, continuous improvement spending metrics, and so forth. In accounting, you have things such as return on assets, such as revenues divided by fixed assets plus working capital, current ratios such as current assets divided by current liabilities, inventory turnover which is cost of goods sold divided by average inventory, net profit, gross profit, which is revenues minus costs of goods sold, and many others. In finance, some of the popular metrics are earnings per share, EPS, which is net income divided by the number of outstanding shares, price to earnings, which is basically market price per share divided by the earnings per share, dividend yield, which is dividend per share divided by the price per share, interest coverage ratio, which is earnings before interest and taxes divided by the interest expense, which is how quickly or how well can the company meet its debt expenses. Then debt to equity ratio, or D to E, which is total liabilities divided by total shareholder equity. In human resources, you have similar metrics such as average absence rates, total number of absent days divided by total number of employees, number of vacancies filled, percentage of staff turnover per period, change in demographic diversity between periods, percentage of staff operating above productivity level, average workforce qualification. In marketing, you have a variety of metrics such as marketing ROI, which is total sales revenues from marketing divided by total marketing expenditures, customer relationship management, CRM, which is percentage of retained customers, market growth rate, market penetration rate, online marketing traffic, sales uplift, which is increase in sales divided by increase in marketing expenditures. In technology and IT, you have a variety of metrics such as percentage of system downtime, per number of incident work orders, average response time, average resolution time, program quality, which is number of errors per period divided by the number of total lines of code, percentage of backlog per request, change quality index, which is total defects divided by total components changed. In project management, you have a slew of metrics such as schedule variance, cost variance, quality variance, cost performance, which is cost overrun if less than 1, earned value, EV, estimated budget consumed to date divided by the actual cost, schedule performance, which is time overrun if less than 1, earnings value divided by predicted time value, percentage over budget, schedule performance, which is completed on time, divided by total completed. And these go on and on. But the interesting thing is, if you look at them closely, regardless of what your industry is, you'll realize that that metric might need to be improved because it really doesn't capture exactly what you want it to capture. And oftentimes it's the burden's on you to choose the right metric or to revise a certain metric in a certain way to either increase more dimensions or to convert it into a proper ratio that makes sense. That will add not only greatest benefit to understanding performance, but also the greatest benefit to your own organization. Choosing metrics is not just something that you do on your own, but oftentimes you involve other people within your company to understand what should go into the right set of metrics. And oftentimes it's important, therefore, to assess interdependencies. For example, let's look at our general process, such as innovation deployment. The corresponding activities, you look at each process and you break them into corresponding activities, tasks, and then the resources that you need to get those tasks and therefore the activities and therefore the process completed. So you could say that innovation deployment requires creating a design criteria and do a feasibility analysis. And the corresponding tasks under design criteria would be component design and R&D sign-off. Under feasibility analysis, the tasks would be market analysis and integration. In order to get these things done, on the design component, you might need R&D scientists. R&D sign-off, you need an IE engineer. Under market analysis, you might need a business executive, and integration, the VP of operations. Once you have all of these resources in play, the importance of knowing these resources and how they correspond to tasks and activities and the processes is to know who to involve in the process of actually building the right set of metrics. And involving the right resources is key because at the end of the day, they will be the ones who will not only be required to have a lock-in into your metrics, but also a buy-in into your metrics to actually get it to be implemented and work as the right performance measure. So you could try an exercise in your own time, which is you can create a dependency matrix for various healthcare activities, so surgery, ER, billing, records management, and whatever it is, or based on your own industry. And then how would you decide on metrics to build KPIs for each of these processes, activities, tasks, and based on these different resources? Similarly, in analytics, the question becomes, which metric should you choose? And this is an example of price leakage that we talked about previously. And this is from industrial products aftermarket, and this is known as the pocket margin waterfall. If you look to the left of it, it says list price, and then to the right, it says pocket margin. Now, the list price is what you wanted to list your item at, right? And this is a problem that many different industrial custom or companies face, that they base their forecast and their revenues based on what they think they're going to sell it for, and they think they're going to be able to sell it for the list price. But at the end of the day, they realize that what they're really getting into their coffers is the pocket price, and this is how things erode over time. So in between list price, you have a 12% negotiated discount that suddenly, after that, you have a 5% preferred customer discount. So you've lost 12% and 5% immediately, which is 17%. And now your invoice price is 83%, from which you get a volume discount or give a volume discount of 8%, a growth programs discount of 3.5%, a promotional discount of 4.5%, an inventory rebate of 6%, upfront rebate of 1.5%, freight of 1.8%, and now suddenly you're left with a pocket price of 57.8%, which is nearly half of what you wanted to sell it at. Then, of course, you've got your standard costs, which is 32%, which is basically your cost of producing the goods or services, and your warranty and your tooling at 5%, and your other costs at 6%, and at the end of the day, your pocket margin for a product that you thought you'd be selling and for 100, like, at an index of 100, that is its full price, you realize you're only getting 12.5% as a pocket margin. And frankly speaking, even had you if you'd taken off all the general costs, which is standard costs, warranty, tooling, and other costs, it would be what, 32 and 11, which is 43, and 2.3, which is 45.3. Had you sold it at a full price, you would have just taken off 45.3, which would have left you with 54.7% as a pocket margin. But you've given so many things such as negotiated discount, preferred customer discount, volume discount, growth programs, promotions, rebates, freight, discounts, inventory discount, rebates, promotions, and all that stuff, that you've ended up with only 12.3%. So oftentimes the question becomes, if you're even looking at what should be the next sales forecast or revenue forecast, I'm going to ask you this question as your own food for thought. Which would be the right measure to use as the correct metric for it? So understanding metrics requires understanding conditional metrics, that ratios are always better than absolutes. Such as, if you're looking at things like depression, risk of heart failure, you have to realize that, well, things relate. Metrics are oftentimes conditional. Risks of heart failure oftentimes is a function of depression. That's what research suggests. And if you don't understand one, you won't be able to understand the other. So a metric is oftentimes conditional. Then, do you need to convert to continuous or stay categorical? Which is, for example, if we say, all right, income moves, you've got different categories of income, less than, I don't know, $20,000 a year, 20,000, greater than $20,000 to less than $40,000, greater than $40,000 to less than $70,000. You create these categories. The question becomes, is it a good idea to create these categories, or do you ask yourself this question, or should you ask yourself this question, that if you're creating these categories as market segments or demographic segments, is there really a difference between the person who earns $19,995 versus a person who earns $20,100? Do you really think they're two different market segments? And you've got to ask yourselves these questions. Converting qualitative to quantitative, items and measurement models and scales. You have to look at what are your measurement models and what are your measurement scales. If it's qualitative, such as text data, data from interviews, data from customers chatting about things, posting reviews on different websites, how can you convert that qualitative measure into quantitative? Things such as surveys, how do you choose the right samples? Oftentimes they say that for some degree of robustness, have about 20 times the number of variables that you're measuring in your survey or in your general idea of what you're trying to get at. So have about 20 times, if not more. So the more the better. And do realize that sampling also has to be representative of the population, which is very, very important. So let's look at the different types of variables in metrics. Firstly, you've got predictor, which are known as independent, treatment, or antecedent variables. Description of each of them, the predictor, independent, treatment, or antecedent variable is as follows. Causes or factors that can explain one or more effects or outcomes. So these are basically causes or factors that explain a certain outcome. So causes can be observed or manipulated. If it's an experiment, you manipulate it. For example, when a placebo is given versus a real drug is given, that's a manipulation of an independent or a treatment variable to look at the impact on the patient's well-being or feeling of well-being. Examples: drug dosage on recuperation, patient services on patient satisfaction, marketing budget on sales, the impact of motivation and performance. These are all predictor or independent or treatment or antecedent variables that will impact the outcomes such as recuperation, patient satisfaction, sales, or performance. Then you've got outcome dependent or criterion variables. These are nothing but effects that are being examined, investigated, and determined as an outcome of various causes. So, such as, these are your outcomes. Is the patient cured versus not cured? How much does it impact income? So, these are all the things you want to figure out. Do certain things in society, in economics, in financial planning impact income? Do certain things in an organization or in society impact satisfaction, performance, costs, profits, a particular score, a particular type of intention? Then, of course, you've got different types of other variables, such as, is the variable binary, which is, if you think of someone is cured versus not cured, that's a binary variable. It can be 1 or a 0, right? So variables that can occur in either one of two states and can be expressed as either or: male, female, cured, not cured, pass, fail, won, lost, complete, incomplete, on, off, yes or no. And binary variables can be either outcome variables or predictor variables. Then you've got categorical variable, which is a type of a nominal variable, which is nominal is by name only, right? It really doesn't have an order. And so just by name. So one doesn't automatically mean is better than the other. It just means they're different. Variables belonging to two, to more than two categories that are independent of each other. So that's a categorical variable. So you have multiple different categories, such as levels of income, might be types of races, might be types of the countries that you come from, or your patients come from, or people come from, or your markets are established, such as levels of income, marital status, married, unmarried, divorced, widowed, party affiliation, Republican, Democrat, Green. One doesn't mean that one's better than the other. It just means that they are multiple different categories, and oftentimes you've got to create the right conversion mechanism for that. Then you've got dummy variables, which are variables recoded from k categorical variables to create a proxy variable coded as k-1. Dummy variables because categorical variables don't have the same intervals and could create confusion in interpretation. So you oftentimes create dummy variables, such as you want to only look at the things that matter. The others, you treat them as what we call as a dummy variable. So if you only want to look at seasonalities, you'd say that, all right, I only want to look at what happens during spring. So whatever we end up selling during summer or autumn or winter, we can recode that as a dummy variable. Therefore, you can just focus on spring. So if a company has seasonal sales across 4 seasons, rather than coding the seasons as 1, 2, 3, 4, it is better to use 3 dummy variables, which is 4 minus 1, that's your k-1. 2, for example, if it's spring, then code the rest of them as 0. So the proper season would have a value of 1 and 0 for the others. Then, of course, you've got ordinal variables, which are categorical ordered variables where the differences between categories are not the same. So these are ordinary variables, different from categorical because there is an order. 2 is greater than 1. 3 is better than 2. 4 is better than 3, and better than 2, and better than 1. So, for example, level of education is an ordinal variable because you're saying that, all right, graduate school is better than college. College is higher than, not better, but I would say higher than high school. High school is higher than middle school. Middle school is higher than having no education, and so forth, where the differences are not the same. Similarly, you could think of position that you hold in a company as being an ordinal because there is an order. One is higher than the other, regardless of whether one is better than the other. Then, of course, there are other variables in metrics, such as interval variables. So interval variables are continuous ordered variables that follow a specific order with exact differences between categories, such as the temperature, 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, have the same difference of 20 between each. Sales, if you say that, if you break it into similar chunks, then you could say that one is better than the other. Performance, time, satisfaction, motivation, utility, these are all interval variables because these are ordered variables where one is better than the other, especially if they're broken into certain segments. You might have sales of, I don't know, 1 million to 5 million as one group, and then greater than 5 million to 10 million as another group, and you could say that one is better than the other. It's interval. Then, of course, you've got ratio variables, which are continuous variables with a numerator and denominator, where 0 signifies an absence. So things that are basically ratios which have a numerator, the top part of a fraction, and the bottom part of the fraction, which is the denominator. Things such as throughput, which is number of units produced per period. So this is nothing but number of units produced divided by the period or number of periods. Productivity, output divided by input, ROI, return on investment, which is the dollars returned divided by the dollars invested, and these are ratio variables. Then, of course, you've got control variables, confounding variables, or spurious variables, which are also known as covariates or extraneous variables, which are nothing but variables outside the relationship between the cause and effect that can influence or confound the results from a certain bias. For example, you might be looking at a company's size or age might even impact a company's performance, even though you might look at, all right, let's look at the particular operational investments we put in and see how that operational investment affected the company's performance. But there might be a confounding variable such as the company's size, which is, if it's too large a company, maybe it takes a longer time to get these operational variables to work across all different divisions and groups, and it might impact it. Similarly, a company's age might impact it because it might be beset or entrenched in tradition where a new innovative operational investment may not take off as quickly as you thought because people still have their old mindset. Then things such as patients' allergies on drug dependency. So, you might look at a patient's allergy in terms of, well, we gave this patient this particular treatment, why didn't it work? It might be that there are other cross interactions, which are these control variables. Similarly, nurture, the impact of nurture on IQ. So you might say that, well, how much education they're getting or how many different types of things they're solving might impact their IQ. But you might find that it is found that nurture is a confounding or a control variable that will also, from the sidelines, impact IQ, even though it might not be an immediate part of your model. Similarly, other metrics are as follows. You've got mediator or intermediary or intervening variable. These are variables that lie between the cause and effects. They help better understand and strengthen the relationship between causes and effects. So innovations can be a mediator between R&D budget and performance because R&D increases innovation and innovation then increases performance. So this sits in the between. These are things. So you might say that, all right, will more money get you or a greater income increase your happiness? You might say that, well, there might not be a direct link, but indirect link in terms of a greater income might allow you greater affordances, and greater affordances might allow you to be happier, and therefore affordances are your mediating or intervening or intermediary variables, or is your intermediary variable, and that is the key. Then, of course, you've got moderating, which is interaction variable. which are nothing but variables that can influence the outcome by combining and influencing other variables in the model. Moderating variables interact with other factors and are multiplicative. So you might say that physician expertise, along with the level of facilities, can increase patient care. So you might be looking at, does physician expertise impact patient care? And you might say, wait, expertise does increase patient care, but it's also influenced or seriously influenced by how good the facilities are. A great physician in a bad facility might not automatically increase patient care, so the level of facilities would moderate the direct impact. So the way you'd calculate that is you would multiply. So you would have physician expertise impacts the patient care, then you'd also have level of facilities impact patient care. And then you would say physician expertise multiplied by the level of facilities would therefore impact patient care. And if the multiplicative term has the strongest influence, then you would say yes, it is truly a very important thing to consider both together rather than both separately. Then you've got endogenous and exogenous variables. Now, endogenous variables are outcomes determined by a model, and exogenous are independent factors unexplained in the model. So a cause and effect model, does not specify exogenous variables. Now, stock price. So endogenous is something that itself is impacted by other things. So stock price, which is an endogenous variable, can be influenced by factors such as sales, products offered. However, consumer sentiment, exogenous, also affects stock price but is not considered because other factors may also drive customer sentiment, right? So some things in the model that are also driven by other things within the model are known as endogenous, and things in the model that are driven by things outside the model are exogenous. Then you've got latent variables, which are nothing but abstract factors that cannot be observed or measured directly, but require the use of other formative variables to measure them. So things such as, if you wanted to say that, how do you measure something like a company's performance? It's not, can't be measured directly. It can be measured indirectly through other things such as earnings per share, such as the productivity of the company, return on assets. So there are multiple measures. So performance therefore becomes a latent variable, which has multiple other measures that basically help measure it, but itself can be measured indirectly. So market environment of a business is a latent variable or construct that needs to be broken down into variables such as geographical scope of the market complexity, as other variables which are nothing but indirect ways of measuring something such as the market environment of a company. Then of course you've got things such as functions in metrics. So any relationship. So we've been talking about how to, finding out the right measures and also understanding what impacts them, what are going back to the causes and the correlations. Here we're trying to look at the causes. How does one impact the other? We could say there's a direct linear impact, which is that one, the cause impacts the outcome constantly at the same rate. That's what being linear is. It's constant and it's at the same rate over time. So at any two relationships, x, such as x and y, where y is the outcome and x are the causes, or x's are the causes, can be depicted as a function as y is a function of x, which means that y depends on x. So shapes of relationships between two variables are shown by various different types of functions. So let's look at some of them. So linear function is when the marginal change, that is rate of change between y and x, remains the same, and they're the same such as revenue per sale of products or service. Each sale increases revenues at the same rate. So if you say that the relationship is linear, it always remains, everything changes at only the same rate over time. For example, if you were to look at the relationship between Celsius and Fahrenheit, there's a formula for Celsius and Fahrenheit. So the rate at which it changes will always remain the same because there is a specific formula and it moves exactly, although it's not linear, there is a constant relationship. So even though there is a sense of nonlinearity, our formula oftentimes can help establish a level of linearity. So, such as if you say, every time um, I increase my product offerings or my innovation offerings in a you know in a period, sales tends to go up by about 1.5 times. So you would say that one single innovation will have a constant 1.5 times effect on sales. And if you think that is the steady state, you would say that, all right, that is a linear combination. So fixed variable costs in production or service, for example, an on-call nurse paid per hour or a contracted labor paid per hour per job increases marginal cost by exactly the same amount would be a linear relationship. Sometimes there are inverse relationship where y is is equal to 1 by x, which is one goes up, the other goes down. So a demand curve is an example of that, where a greater price at which you offer things will lower the quantity that the market will demand or the customers will demand. Opportunity cost and indifference curves, where one has to forego one resource opportunity for another. So if you have a fixed set, you have to choose between one. You know that if you choose one, you can't choose the other, or if you choose one, you have to choose less of the other at a fixed rate. Then it's an inverse function. So one goes up, the other goes down. So inverted yield curves, where short-term debt instruments offer more yield. So yield drops as debt instruments become long-term. So as you're saying that if it's a shorter-term debt instrument, you have to offer more yield, but yield will drop if the instrument becomes long-term, if debt becomes long-term. That's an inverted yield curve. A Phillips curve, such as when unemployment decreases, inflation increases. So you would say that, all right, anytime when unemployment goes up, inflation will go down. When unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. And it makes sense because all you're saying is more people are employed means more money coming into the economy. People have more power to purchase things. Therefore, they're going to end up driving prices up in the market, which is nothing but the measure of inflation. Then, of course, you've got something like square, which is a type of quadratic relationship, where you're saying y is equal to x squared. So productivity and performance dip after, and this is how the structure looks like. So productivity and performance dip after project initiation or merger and acquisition, and then rises again. Quantitative easing or economic recovery or debt financing and income. So as you've got more quantitative easing, economic recovery will get possibly either better, worse, and then it'll level out. Debt financing and income. So it'll keep going down over time. At one point of time, it'll hit rock bottom and then go up. So there's a cyclical effect. Machine or resource use and production because of lowering of marginal costs and then increasing marginal costs from repairs and overtime. So if you keep working a machine or a person over time, then they might basically start sort of slowing down, or the productivity might look like it's going up, but then it'll dramatically fall before it rises again. Square root, and this is how a square root function looks like. Price and profit function, so y is a square root of x. Price and profit function, where increase in price will increase profit, after which profit will drop if price increases too much. So there's a leveling off. Impact of training on productivity. Some training is good, too much training is actually going to negatively impact it or might not actually impact productivity at all. Price increases and profits, where raising prices can increase profit, and after the optimal price, profits will drop from loss in sales. Supply curve, with more price will attract more supply, but after that, because of productivity or productivity constraints, it'll level off. Other functions in metrics, you've got exponential ones, which is y is equal to e to the power of x, which is the exponential function, such as spread or growth of a contagion, population, bacteria, or virus. Oftentimes they use this model. Growth of users in a popular social network. So the social network has an exponential sort of performance based on the number of users. More users post more things. The more they post things, it's shared across. So there's an exponential, so it increases at an increasing rate. Interest paid for a debt or mortgage, where interest compounding increases the costs of debt rapidly over time. Supply curve showing price and quantity supplied. Depreciation of an asset. Of course, here the exponential decay will make the x negative. So if it goes the other way, it just turns the x negative. Then, of course, if you've got logarithmic setups, which is and things such as y is a log of x. So entropy or decay till the curve flattens, such as reduction in employment, size or magnitude of growth of a stock portfolio. At one point of time, it might flatten. Employee motivation, which might again flatten over the long run. Income and standard of living. But you've got to know that a log-based logic curve function is opposite of that of a sigmoid function. Now, which takes us therefore to a sigmoid function, which is it starts off at a level set, then increases at an increasing rate, and then it levels off again. And y is here a function of 1 divided by 1 plus e to the power negative x. And an example of that is a very famous one, is the very famous S-shaped market curve, which is the market penetration for new products, where one or few companies enter the market with a new product. As the product gets popular, more competitors enter to claim a piece of the pie till there is market saturation with no further growth and intense rivalry between competitors. At that point of time, a lot of competitors fall out and the market stabilizes again. Such as adoption and popularity of a new product service introduced to the market over time is another example of a sigmoid S-shaped function. Finally, talking about transforming for better metrics. Oftentimes when you start looking at the probability of things happening and how your data plot shows the nature and structure of your data over time or over a particular change in a particular variable, you might find that it might look like a normal curve, which is the center is heavy and equally distributed on both sides. A positive skew where the center tends to move to the left, and a negative skew where the center tends to move to the right, which in this case might be that, well, if it is place where it has a lot of income and very few people are poor, it might very well show that it's a negative skew, because to the right might be greater higher income and the probability is to the right. On the other hand, if it's a very poor neighborhood where most people are poor and very few people are well off or wealthy, it might have a positive skew where things are pressed to the left, which is lower. So symmetry is what you call it. So skewness is the asymmetry of a variable. So symmetry is a signal of the distribution of values. A negative skew, too many values to the right. Positive skew is too many values to the left. And a normal distribution is zero skewness as a proper assumption of the population distribution. That the population distribution in general is where it should look more like a normal distribution. And oftentimes, when you do your analytical modeling, a lot of models will require you to test if your sample is normally distributed, or certain things like residuals are normally distributed. So for a left skew, the mode, which is most often, is greater than the median, which is your middle point, is greater than the mean, which is your average. For a right skew, your mean is greater than the median, and which is greater than the mode. So to reduce right skewness, take square roots or logarithms or reciprocals. This is the most common problem in practice. So to reduce left skewness, take squares or cubes or high powers. This is how you transform the data. So again, if you have right skewness, take convert the data into square roots or logarithms or reciprocals. Um, Typically logarithms or reciprocals. And if you want to reduce left skewness, take squares or cubes or higher powers. So that's how you transform the data to make it closer to being a normal distribution, so that your measures, your analytical inferences and your techniques will properly work. And then there's of course something called the Box-Cox transformation, where all you do is it's x to the power of lambda minus 1 divided by lambda, and then there's a table from which you basically say that based on your data, the best lambda to choose would be if this you choose x squared if it's 1.2, 1.5 to 2.5, and it's basically a square, and your lambda chosen is 2. But 0.75 to 1, you just keep it there, you don't transform it, and your lambda is equal to 1. But that's your general transformation. You choose your lambda and you see what your best lambda is based on the lambda chosen, and therefore your transformation. So it goes right up to negative 2.5 to negative 1.5, which is 1, and then you transform it by 1 divided by y squared, which is an inverse square. And so basically in this case, your lambda that you've chosen is negative 2. And that will show you how you stand or where you stand. And so all you're doing is you're converting a particular variable to make it less skewed by using Box-Cox transformation, by playing around or experimenting with the different lambdas and seeing which one works, based on which you can therefore choose the right transformation.